News Talk 1400 KFRU is proud to present the KFRU Heritage Series. It's a one-hour perspective on the events and the people whose lives have contributed to the heritage of Boone County. Listen each Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. The KFRU Heritage Series. From News Talk 1400, KFRU.
The Heritage Series this month is just going to kind of explore different history of different parts of Boone County and Columbia, and we've got two who are very well versed in history of a certain type that you've heard before, probably on radio in this market, and you've heard before on KFRU, because even though Chris Kellogg works at another radio station, he does once in a while get his voice on KFRU. So Chris Kellogg is here, who is my immediate boss, and then Al Germond, who has been a part of KFRU's history for quite a long time. Al, I'll start with you first, because you came from the East Coast to Columbia.
Correct.
When?
1963.
And what attracted you to this area?
Well, several things. It was a virgin FM market. There was no FM radio here at all. And I had a dream to build an FM station, which I did actually get to realize, and built KPLA, which started out as KARO in 1983. So it was a virgin market. There was nothing here on FM radio. It was a blank dial, and so it looked like a good place to get into that. It took a while. It took me almost 20 years to get that done, but it got done. It also was the home of a journalism school and a university that would accept me. And so it was also a transition from the East, from getting out of the woolly suburbs of New York and moving to an area where you had kind of prairie and buffalo roams and all that sort of stuff. And it was an interesting transformation from a cultural standpoint.
If you were a radio listener in the early 60s and there were no FM stations, other than KFRU, what was on the radio dial?
There were two local AM stations, KFRU at 1400 and KTGR, which at the time was referred to as KCGM, was at 1580, Key to Columbia's Good Music, a station that began as KCMU. The university filed a complaint because of similarity of call letters with the television station. It became KBIA. Interestingly enough, and it operated under that call sign until 1961, then became KCGM, became KTGR in 1967, and I guess it's still called that. There were some area stations. There was a station in Fulton. There was a station in Moberly. There was one in Jeff City. They kind of interfered with each other. And then you had what came in from St. Louis and Kansas City. So Top 40 listening came to us via WHB in Kansas City, Store-owned property, and KXOK in St. Louis in the daytime. At night, they faded out. We then would listen to KAAY in Little Rock,
yes,
and WLS in Chicago. And if we were into top 40 music, that's where we got our music. We also had record players at the time. And so in the dorm, people actually had record players.
In the dorm room, you had record players.
And they went out, they had these little record players, and they would go down to a place like Cottage Music, which was on Broadway, and buy 45s for 89 cents or something like that. And that was where we got our music.
I am curious because this is a technical question that you can answer. Why can't we listen to the AM stations as easily now from those markets that you just referred to as we used to? Because I could pick up 61 Country, WHB at 71, KCMO at 81, out of Kansas City. I listened to those things growing up all the time, but now I'd have a hard time doing that.
There's a lot more what we call electrical noise. There also have been a lot of what I would say grievous mistakes by our wonderful federal government in the way allotments and assignments and the technical scheme of broadcasting has evolved, and it basically has robbed us of those opportunities to hear those distant stations. When I moved here, you could pick up New York and the West Coast at night on most radios. You cannot do that anymore. Yeah. There's just too much clutter.
Now, I had a chance to grow up. My dad was into country music, and so we would
listen to...
He
was a DJ, wasn't he?
No, he went around to talk to the DJs about playing his 45.
Didn't he perform on the air?
He did, yeah. And he had bought time in Sullivan, Missouri on a station called KTUI, where, by the way, Dave Schmidt got his radio starts. It's over on KOMU. Yeah. And so he did that. But we also listened to WBAP out of Fort Worth, Dallas, and WSM, of course, out of Nashville for the Grand Ole Opry.
Yeah.
Where was WLW, because I listened to that also.
Cincinnati.
Yeah, Cincinnati.
Yeah, that's another one. In fact,
WHAS out of Louisville.
Some of those stations you can still hear at night here if the conditions are correct. They're so-called clear channel stations. They operate with 50,000 watts, and they have a big signal.
Again, Al Germond and Chris Kellogg are here. All right, Chris, when did you start your radio career?
I started in 1978 in Union, Missouri. And just like Al, I was still listening to AM. I mean, I was into KXOK out of St. Louis. The St. Louis market was primarily my influence from East Central Missouri. And then WLS, KAAY out of Little Rock, which you already mentioned too. Those were good times. And when we started, we were still playing the 45s, Al. And they had little dots on them. A blue meant that you played that one more frequently. The red dot meant you played it a little less frequently. And the yellow meant that it was old music, and it was usually the original version of like Hello Walls by Willie Nelson. 'Cause I was working country music at the time with KLPW in Union, Missouri.
Well, that's one of the things I want to ask you about, because used to the work intensity of a music shift was a lot more than it is now. I mean, now there's no intensity to it, basically, because most music shifts at times no one is there. But when you used to do radio, it was so hands-on. I mean, that was what made it great, because your songs would have been shorter.
Yes.
And they would have had to be queued up, each one individually, because you mentioned 45. Sometimes there were albums that you would play a cut from, but you put it on a turntable. You have that turntable kind of with the clutch, I guess, disengaged is how I would do it, and so it would roll freely. And then you'd make sure that you back it up a half turn, because when you start a 45 or a 33, it's going to take a moment to get up to speed, so you don't wow the beginning of a song. I mean, all those things were great.
Yeah, and that's how we started it all. And Alan and I've talked about this many times. Both the front of the songs, from being because you had the needle or the stylus on your record player, you'd slide it back and forth a few times to make sure you've got the song ready to go in the right position. It'd start getting a little scratchy. Well, we called it cue burn.
Yeah, cue burn.
And even worse is if especially with country music, because frequently it was just a guy and his guitar, right? And the song would be fading down, and all of a sudden you'd hear this at the end, and that was from people eating donuts in the studio.
Well, we used to call that finger fat.
From touching the inside of what you thought was the inside of the 45.
There was an announcer at this very radio station who used to take his finger and actually wet it, and wherever he had set it down, there were all these globs of finger fat. I think that man is still alive and living in this market. But anyway, that was one of the hazards. The other hazard, of course, was the turntables had a gear shift on them. And at this station, in the old Studio A, the cord from the telephone frequently got into the gear shift mechanism, and so what was supposed to be playing at 33 might end up at 78.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, Chris, the little dots on the 45s. Now, many of us worked at radio stations that did not have that, and we had such a freedom to play what we wanted to play. Address the freedom that used to exist and the kamikaze, we will do this restrictions that exist now from some central place that affects every song that everybody hears in every radio throughout this great country of ours.
Conceptually, it's still pretty much the same. Is you would take from the front and put it in the back and create a rotation, and of course you would do that manually. Now, frequently you'd come in and the person before your show would leave all these horrible songs, and you were supposed to play those, and you're like, I'm not going to play that. How many times do we have to listen to Billy Ray Cyrus, Achy Breaky Heart or something? You move that to the back or whatever, and so it essentially set up a rotation so that you weren't playing the same song every hour. So that was kind of the idea. Since then, we've streamlined, obviously, and we've gone to computer systems to help balance out those rotations for us. And again, it's to fight that perception of repetition that we don't want. What we want is we want the listener.
Chris, you're talking about an actual format, and I can tell you, in the old days when I went to work at KFRU, there was no format per se. There was a huge collection of records, and each announcer would come in and kind of pick their favorites. And it was a mess, a complete mess. The only time they had formats was in the morning. They had a show called Morning Country Style, which was country music. You didn't play Brahms in that period. And then there was a program in the late evening, before the advent of the FM stations, called Disc Derby, and that actually played the top 40 hits of the day. But otherwise, the music mess here, it was a melange of a lot of just odd stuff that would be pulled from this record library with no real planning or order. But it was the only radio station to speak of. It had 60 shares in the surveys because that's what you listened to. There was very little else that you could listen to during the daytime. And so KFRU had this entire market kind of as a captive to whatever went through the announcer's mind in terms of a music, quote, format, unquote.
That people could depend on. I mean, the personalities came through a lot more because knew if your taste matched what that person's taste was or not. What is the science behind it now, Chris? Because on a music station, people used to, maybe they could hear currents and recurrents and those. What are the categories now, and what's the science or the philosophy behind how it is mixed now?
Yeah, it's you try not to stay into one period for very long. Typically, you try not to play too many new songs back to back. You always want to reinforce a new song with a song that everybody knows, so it's familiar, because frequently new music is considered unfamiliar. And so there's always a risk that people aren't going to like, the new Taylor Swift song, for example, who crosses over and plays on both top 40 and country. So you want to reinforce afterwards. You want to come back and play, one of your favorite Air Supply songs or something someone's familiar with. You know what I mean?
But there are. I mean, it is scientific now. I mean, they try to do it either through calling up somebody, or maybe they send it now through files and say, rate this record. I mean, rate this song. Do you like it? Are you tired of it? Do you want to hear more of it?
Well, auditorium tests.
Yeah,
I mean, that's one thing.
Yeah. I think that it was interesting when I started working at KARO, and that was a long time ago, and I remember filling out my sheets as to what I played, because we had certain categories, and then you had a clock saying this is the way that you would play that. It will sound strange to say this now, but I hear it every once in a while when I hear female singers back-to-back or black groups back-to-back. That used to be forbidden. I can remember starting working here where you would not play two women back-to-back. You would not play two certain types of group back-to-back. It was just something that program directors got from consultants saying, don't do that.
We recently were having a conversation internally about that, and because of the diversity of the artists that are out there, the problem is let's go to country music as the example. I mean, there was Loretta Lynn and there was Tammy Wynette. You'd be hard-pressed to come up with another female artist, maybe. So there weren't that many female artists at the time, for example. So you would never play them back-to-back. You'd try to spread them out among the men, the Conway Twitty, Merle
This
Haggard
was in the This was 1988 to 1991 or so on the soft rock stations.
But still,
it's amazing though.
The case was still the same.
Yeah.
Other than Celine Dion, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, you didn't have a whole lot of other female artists. So the idea was not to play them back to back. Now we have so many. We have so many female artists. We have so many male groups. We have so many boy bands. We have so many urban artists that have crossed over into the more contemporary area as well. And so it doesn't matter as much now that those genres or those types of music are played back to back.
Couple of minutes before our first break, how were commercials played, Al?
Well, originally all commercials were read live, basically. The first commercial on the radio was in 1922. It was a 15-minute talk on WEAF in New York about an apartment complex in Queens, which was one of the boroughs of New York City. And I'm not sure it got any results, and they got, I think, $100 for it. But it was the first commercial. Later on, as the 20s and 30s advanced and commercial radio took off, they started using orchestras and bands. And so recording came in the early 1930s via something called a transcription, which was a big 16-inch piece of aluminum that you could actually make a recording on. And so most radio stations, including KFRU, had a disc cutter, and they actually would cut these records. You would make your own. It was kind of a one-shot. I mean, it was you didn't make copies of this thing. And so they would bring bands in and record what we referred to as a donut very often. You'd have 10 or 15 seconds of music, a jingle, if you want to call it that. Then there'd be the middle of the donut, the hole, where there might be 30 seconds of copy. And they would say, well, come on down to your local such and such, and they'd read the price items of a grocery store or something like that. Then the close would be another 15 seconds, would say, that's right, go to so-and-so's, whatever. And this was a responsibility, once this thing was recorded, of an engineer, because up until the late 1950s, KFRU actually had what we referred to as an engineer-announcer setup. There was an engineer who sat in a control room, and that individual, and they were members of IBEW, I think Local 2 out of St. Louis. They were union shop engineers. And they were responsible for actually running all the technical aspects of the radio station. The announcer sat in a room with a microphone. There was no combo operation, as they call it today, with a console, with a board, with a mixing panel. And so the engineer would sit there with this disc, and he'd cue it up, and you'd have to sit there as the announcer with your copy in front of you for, let's say, Kenray IGA, which was a grocery store here in town, or Temple Stevens. The old Temple Stevens burned, or part of it burned yesterday, or recently. And you'd insert this copy. Later on, the so-called card, which they don't even use in radio stations anymore because everything now is on a computer, but a card is a small piece of plastic that kind of looks like an 8-track. That came in about 1958 and 59, and that very much simplified the process of recording these commercials and playing them back.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back and we'll pick up on that when we return. It's a Heritage Series talking about the history of radio, especially here in this area with Al Germond and Chris Kellogg. This is the Heritage Series on KFRU.
This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
Our discussion today is on the Heritage Series and the heritage of radio in Boone County and in Columbia, and some about KFRU, although we branched out because our guests know much more than just KFRU programming. Chris Kellogg is here. He's program director for the radio stations owned by Cumulus in this market. Al Germond, former owner of KFRU and originator of so much that has happened with radio in several different ways, because when he was owning the radio station that was KARO, it became the owner of KFRU. When did you buy that, Al?
10 years ago, almost exactly, 1992.
Well, that's about 20 years ago.
Yeah,
Time's
20 years ago.
That's 20 years ago.
Wow.
Sometimes I wish I still had it. It's gone.
You were talking about engineers, and you were talking about the people that contributed to make a radio station work, and an engineer that would run the equipment, and also the announcers and everybody else that was involved. It's so much different now. One of the things that's different, I remember when I wanted to work on radio, I had to get a radio license. I had to pass a test, like a third class something or other, if my memory is correct.
Correct.
What was the motivation behind that, and how has that changed up to current day?
Well, that was regulation. I mean, the government started regulating radio in 1927 in earnest, and the FCC came along in 1934, and they set standards. They produced rules, and they wanted the people on the air to be responsible in the case of an emergency or to know how the equipment ran. And so a lot of the procedure behind licensing was to know basically how to run the basic functions of the radio station, and tied in with an emergency. What would happen? What would you do if there was a civil emergency or something like that? And how would you handle the operation of the radio station? Well, those rules got tossed out. Everything in radio got deregulated. Much of it got deregulated about 30 years ago, and the license disappeared. It was called the third-class ticket, and it was something you went to Kansas City and took, and you paid, I don't know, $1 or something, and they mailed it to you, and you hung it on the wall. And the FCC inspector would walk in, and he'd be counting the licenses and say, "Oh, this one's out of date. We're going to fine you or something."
I can remember, actually, it was a complicated thing at the time when I was a student at the University of Missouri. Roger Kowalski made us go through a class, and I can remember taking the test up in the deepest top of Hearn Center. That seemed like quite a stressful test.
That was a hard test.
It was a hard test. I mean, it was like, holy cow, you wanted me to know some of these things. I'm not an engineer. But then one of the rules was don't ever touch certain things because you better call an engineer to get it in should you need it, because this was third class. It limited you in what you were going to be able to do.
Well, I went and studied for the second and first class ticket because I actually was an engineer, a broadcast engineer, was responsible for radio stations, including the construction of my own station, the first one. And so that test was really hard. That involved a lot of high math and regulations and things of that sort. But all that's been thrown away. There are no licenses anymore. A refrigerator repairman could legally, I guess, fix a transmitter. I'm not putting down refrigerator repairmen, but I mean, it's interesting how the standards in the bar has been lowered. And I guess with it, we've compromised the quality of some of the people that work in the business.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I just wanted to mention one thing. One of the positives of the deregulation, Al, is in many markets you would have an AM and FM radio station, but it actually, some of that deregulation gave you an opportunity to actually build a cluster of radio stations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was an interesting reg on the books from about 1969 to about 71, where the government was actually in the process of telling people who owned an AM-FM combo they would have to sell one of them. I mean, antitrust there was a great deal more regulation 30, 40, 50 years ago than there is today. And the government was very concerned. They didn't want newspapers owning radio and television stations. Well, now most of those bars have been dropped, many of them for economic purposes, because we're all trying to survive.
I won't start on. I understand what you two are saying for the economic purposes, but I got to say this: I don't think radio's better now than it was 20 years ago.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. We could do another program about that.
Yeah. I'm thinking for people who wanted to make a lot of money and run it on the cheap and run it as a profit-making business where you don't have the personnel that you used to have. In KFRU's heyday, how big was the KFRU news department?
Well, it had 4 people. In fact, it was closely associated. I mean, the Columbia Tribune owned the radio station between the family that owns the Tribune had they initially had 55%. Then they bought the whole thing out in 1983 or 84. And they sold it in 1989. So there was a close connection with the Tribune. The Tribune contributed news to the radio station for many years. In fact, the newsroom for the radio station was in the Tribune building from the late 40s until 1976. And so you had the collaboration between the newspaper and the radio station.
And how much programming on a typical 24-hour day was not originated locally?
Oh, virtually all of it. I mean, a tiny percentage. Only the stuff that came from the network, basically. It was an entirely homegrown product with live announcers in the room 24/7.
Yeah.
The radio station went 24 hours in the summer of 1961. It went off the air periodically for maintenance and things like that. But, I mean, it was a 100% locally staffed operation.
We have things now that are more sophisticated, but you can go anywhere, and this is not a cut at Rush Limbaugh or Dave Ramsey or Clark Howard or Bill or whoever has had radio. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to hear those, but you sacrifice certain things to be able to hear that, I think, in local markets. Chris, your experience, a lot of people would remember you, especially in this market, as the man on KFMZ. What was KFMZ like in its heyday?
Well, actually, I walked in the door just as they turned off this wall of automation. They had the big reel. Al, you know what I'm talking about.
The big Schaefer, yes.
Because I think eventually that was sold to Stevens College.
Stevens has it, yes.
To their campus. But it was a reel-to-reel automation system. And so a way a radio station could do things more cheaply with FM was to use this reel-to-reel automation, and it required somebody to program it. It required somebody to be there to monitor. We called it live assist, and basically you were talking live while the reel-to-reels played all the music and what have you, so you didn't have to deal with the 45s that we were talking in the earlier segment. Since then, computers have that kind of initiated what then became computers once hard drives got large enough.
But that tape was very thin, and it stretched a lot, at least at the radio station that I worked at, and sometimes static electricity would stop a reel-to-reel tape. And we programmed our automation up in Moberly at a station up there, Cress, which was, I think, one of the I guess, originators of a certain type of automation, maybe.
They had a limited system when they went on the air in the fall of '66.
Yeah, and we'd have to try to program with a cassette that hardly ever worked to program the automation. I mean, it was really a weird system.
Now, the reason why we turned off the automation was the advent of new technology, which were the CDs, because CDs were coming out. You could start buying all these rock and roll greatest hits, Heart and Doors and all these things. And so we'd play, probably half of our music off the CD, and the other half would come off the old cartridges that Al was talking about earlier with commercials. So it was that new technology. And, of course, little did we know that was just a temporary return to the old days of getting a song ready to play. It eventually would end up on a computer since it was already digital.
What did you like about those days, though, of mornings on KFMZ? What was different about that? You were younger, obviously, so you probably had a different, less managerial approach to what you were doing on the radio at that time. But, I mean, there was a certain freedom. There was a certain loosening up of what was happening.
Yeah, there was. I mean, we still had our share of consultants by the mid-'80s. We had consultants. Prior to that, we never really dealt with consultants, but they were trying to shape things. They wanted you to say things a certain way or do things a certain way, and being in my 20s, I certainly did my share of rebelling. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Some of us continue to rebel longer into our life than others. But I mean, can you remember any of what were some of the unusual or risky things that you might have done that you remember?
Well, it's interesting because it was a rock station, and we could get edgier with our humor, first of all, and we could freely attack the politicians of the day. Think of Johnny Carson. I remember when Ronald Reagan was elected president, Johnny Carson always depicted George Bush Sr. as being the clown of the administration. I mean, it was hilarious, and to my sense of humor, that was quite appealing. So you can imagine, late 80s, George Bush, the clown of the Reagan administration, decides to run for president. Well, that's nothing but humor on a rock station at that time. Now we have to be so much more careful. It's almost as if we're walking on eggshells. We can't quite freely express some of the things in a humorous context
why
that maybe
is
we
that?
used to be able to
Because the people that are on KFRU, the big names like the Rush Limbaugh and other people, and on the cable talk TV stations, and on Comedy Central, and the nighttime guys are still doing the same thing Johnny Carson does. Why do you feel restricted?
I think part of it is I think a lot of people use music radio as more of an escapism, as opposed,
it's out there, so where can I go to get away from it?
Where can I get away from it? And I think that's a pretty standard philosophy across the industry anymore.
When it comes to music radio. We get into a little discussion here, and this probably is another program, but up until July of 1987, the country broadcasting scene was governed by what was called the fairness doctrine, the personal attack rule. And so radio stations very much had to toe the line in terms of personal attack on anybody and giving them the right to reply. And then fairness, which had to do with the treatment of issues and giving some fairness and balance. Now, that in removing all of that in the summer of 1987, that basically paved the way for this current genre of talk television and radio, which I would argue has become somewhat acidic, somewhat hateful, and probably not beneficial in the long run to the overall sanity of the country, if I can go so far as to say.
I think Chris would know this, you would, Al, and I think I've experienced this also. People like to dredge that back up if you put an opinion on the radio that they don't agree with. So in other words, if they've agreed with the 3 hours of the midday on KFRU, but somebody between 10 and 11 or 8 and 9 says something regularly, I'll get emails or phone calls saying, well, are you going to have somebody from the other side on? It's like, do you ask that of the other 3 hours that's on in the middle of the day? No, you don't, because it's your opinion that is matched by the speaker. When that opinion is challenged, though, then it's like people want to go back to the fairness doctrine and say, well, how about the opposing view? Aren't you supposed to have that?
I remember the day that it was revoked, and my attorney in Washington at the time, Michael Rosenblum, called me and said, look, the fairness doctrine's gone away. He was my Washington attorney, my D.C. lawyer. And we talked about it for a little while, and he said, well, they threw it out because it was impossible to administer on the government level. It's not that it was bad. It's just that the FCC was dealing. They had piles and stacks of petitions, and they couldn't deal with this stuff. So they just threw the whole thing out. Now, they tried to revive it. Ernest Hollings, a senator from South Carolina, tried to bring it back. But Reagan or Bush, I forget who it was, vetoed it, and so it hasn't come back. Now, personal attack is something different. I kind of am a believer in personal attack. I think if someone is attacked and assaulted on the radio, they should be given the opportunity. I'm not speaking for this company. I'm speaking for myself. They should be given the opportunity. If you called, you had the mayor on your radio program from time to time, and if you say something nasty about a public official, I think that public official has the right to be heard and to have his or her moment on the air to basically rebut what was said in opposition to him.
I don't disagree.
Probably way off topic.
No, I don't. I like that.
But there's no legal reason anymore.
No, not since 87.
I'm just saying that in people's minds, when they don't like something that they hear, they will dredge up to be fair, you've got to have the other side on, don't you? So it's people don't realize, no, there's no obligation to do that anymore.
No, it's
I don't
gone.
have to do that.
It's been gone for 25 years.
Al Germond, Chris Kellogg are our guests. We're in the middle of our Heritage Show, and that is one of the long format shows that we do, so we can chase whatever we want to when we're doing that. What was Chris mentioned consultants, and Chris mentioned certain things that kind of kept them going in the right direction on a rock station like KFMZ. But on KFRU, what was their quality control? Who was in control of what their programming was going to be
we had a consultant, a man from Michigan, who I have contacted and talked to from time to time, and one of his big raves
But
was...
prior to him, when I'm talking about in the days where...
consultant? There was nothing.
You had Malin Aldridge.
Yeah,
How was he as far as...
Well, Malin was a guy who believed in news. He was very much a believer in news and public events, and because he had basically the only radio station, the only full-time radio station in the market, he was beholden to all these different groups that were complaining or commenting about something. And I'll never forget coming back here in 1973, and Malin was complaining about all these new radio stations. KBIA had gone on the air, KOPN had gone on the air, and KCOU had gone on the air. So you'd had this increase in number of radio stations. They weren't competitive per se, but they were in the sense that they took audience. And Malin was complaining about it. And I said, Mr. Aldridge, don't complain. They have taken the pressure off of you to play classical music, to play operas, to play zither music, to play whatever, because he had all these different people coming out there to see him. Somebody wanted to hear, Gregorian chants. And he said, look, I don't have time on the air. Go to somebody else and pray to them for Gregorian chants.
The KFRU dominated in many ways then through this time period. As other stations came in, did they respond to that threat in any specific way other than what you just said? I'll let them take some of these things we don't know.
They did respond in a sense, and then there was some order brought into the music formatting in the 80s. And I can remember going through, when we bought the station, the record collection was a complete mess. The records had been trashed. It looked like they'd been roller skated across. But there was a system, kind of what Chris was referring to, of color codes and arrows and stars and asterisks and things like that to indicate, don't play this one or do play that one. Now, Malin had a very interesting record control situation in the 50s because Mr. Aldrich detested television. He hated TV. And so anything on a record that had anything to do with TV, meaning the theme for Mr. Lucky, which was a TV program in the late 1950s, they actually would take a sharp object and scratch out certain cuts so you couldn't play them because of this allusion to a television program. That was perhaps a very early form of music format control.
Go ahead, Chris. I want to ask you a question about the FM stations because Al's talked about no AM. The AM station is pretty limited at this time, and when he came out here, there were no FM stations. But if you wanted to say anything that he had about what was going on with the attitude towards programming,
I'll point out first of all, the first FM station here was KWWC, which began as a 10-watt facility over at Stevens College. Had a range of about a block, I think. Didn't really get out very far, but it was an FM station. There were FM stations established at the end of '66 in Moberly in Mexico that kind of bled into the market. KTGR put an FM station on the air in December of 1967, which simulcast the AM and was playing top 40 music. KFMZ, though, was the first of the real breaking, brand new, modern FM independent radio stations, and it was stereophonic.
Yeah.
The other FM
that was
stations,
a big deal.
they were all mono, and this was stereo. And the owner of that station, who had a rather unfortunate fate and lost the license, it was revoked about 10 years ago. And the station's not on the air anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. The frequency is open and waiting for the FCC to open it up for bidding or whatever. But the KFMZ was very much at the top of the line when it came to technology and nice, clean music reproduction and playing music that happened to be very relevant at the early 70s, mid-70s to the time, and attracted a huge audience, particularly from the college community.
And I think the only thing I wanted to chime on, David, was when Al was talking about it kind of started bringing order. As it got more competitive, you kind of found what your station was going to talk about. In the case of KFRU, it was a little softer kind of music. When I came to town in 1985, it certainly was news and Ellen Shank and a lot of talk information as well. And so stations kind of refined themselves and narrowed their appeal as opposed to the old days of
the generalist approach.
As opposed to trying to be all things to all people. Everything became a little more narrow, and I think that probably started, Al, with, like you said, as the competition increased in the marketplace.
One more break, and we'll come back for another segment, our final segment on the Heritage Series today. It's going to go by fast, talking about radio with two guys who have been a part of radio, and it's been an important part of their lives. Al Germond and Chris Kellogg, our guests. We'll take a break. This is the Heritage Series on KFRU.
This is the KFRU Heritage Series.
Our final segment today with Al Germond and Chris Kellogg on the Heritage Series, and we're talking radio history and local history. Chris's career, how many different radio stations? You ever count up how many radio stations you've worked at?
No, I guess 3 or 4 here in Columbia since 1985, I guess.
And from the early days in Union, Missouri.
Yeah.
And what was that? What were the call letters?
KLPW.
Stood
for Leslie P. Ware.
Yes.
Al knows this because the FM was real close to his original FM that he signed on.
It was on the same frequency, in fact.
Yes. 101.7 at the time.
Did it have a slogan?
No.
Well,
no, I don't think it did. It was kind of, it was the only radio station just, kind of like in the area you grew up. There was always that one radio station. KFRU was always it for Columbia, and KLPW for Union in Washington, Missouri, and yours in Macon, Missouri.
Radio Ranch was what it was called, but that wasn't the biggie. We were down at Moberly, where they had all kinds of little things, Quicks and Crests. You never did KWIX unless you were doing an official.
A very sophisticated radio station in its day.
Was, and that's amazing because when I was a student down here at the University of Missouri, I was taking a class at the J School, and I didn't graduate from the journalism school. I wasn't in the J School, but I had some opportunity to take classes there. And in a business broadcasting class, I can remember the professor using what was Gerald Shepard's baby up there, and he did it well, because I think they wrote it up in Harvard. I mean, some big magazine or
Gerald
some big
Shepard,
journal.
who's deceased now, built the station in 1950, and he delivered an address of how he billed something like $300 and something thousand in a market in a city of 13,000. Mm-hmm. He was the originator, basically, of a regional concept. He went out to the surrounding communities. He put the FM station on the air in '66, and he really honed to a science the idea of public service and commitment to all those communities.
And by the way, this year he's being inducted into the Missouri Broadcasters Hall of Fame along with the legendary Jack Buck.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Which is really neat. That'll happen later this summer.
It's too bad I didn't get to see it because I knew Gerald moderately well. I worked for him for a couple of summers, and he was a class act.
He was interesting. I mean, he got called into his office, and it was immaculate. And he sat there behind that desk, and he had this big, deep voice, and he was a round man anyway. And he's
that's because you were 14 at the time.
I was older than that, but he called me in after doing a play-by-play from the night before where a couple of coaches had gotten into a skirmish, and he says, "David, we don't tell it like it is."
I've got a quick question for you. My first time in a radio station was in Sullivan, Missouri, and my dad had a country band, and he actually recorded his program and actually bought a half hour of radio time on the radio station in Sullivan, Missouri, and then went out and sold his live read commercials to basically liquidate the cost of buying that programming. Didn't KFRU have all these live performers at one time, bands and what have you?
Yes, it did, because they didn't have recording machines. They didn't play a lot of records. And KFRU in the early 30s, I'm going to say right after Stevens sold it, which was in July of 32, there was a group from St. Louis that came in and bought it. They moved it into a building which is now on the northeast corner of Elm and 9th Street.
Well, it's across the street from Shakespeare's.
The Methodist Church
and the Methodist Church has built their addition there.
But
Jack in the Box used to be there. Then Wendy's used to be there.
The old University Club building, and they moved it in there. They were a corporation, so they were trying to make money. And the singers, the yodelers, the pickers, the musicians lived on the third floor in sort of a dormitory. The studios were on the second floor. The offices were on the first floor. And they had 2 studios, had brand new Western Electric equipment in it. It was a good facility. It had 1,000 watts on 630, which gave it statewide coverage. And at night, there was very little interference. So KFRU literally had listeners all over the country, if not the world. But these yodelers and pickers would come down and perform in the early morning. And the engineer would have to go up and wake these people up. They'd come down in their pajamas or whatever, and they'd be singing and yodeling and picking and playing bluegrass.
Did they also work in that? Was it news and talk? What was the format? Do you know much more of the format?
Well, until 1934, the station actually divided time on the frequency, 630. It divided time with a station owned by the State Marketing Board called WOS, Watch Our State. And that disappeared in 34. They closed the station down. They used the transmitter, reused it, redeployed it for dispatching the state patrol. But they were only on in the morning from 6 until 9, and WOS was on the rest of the daytime. Then KFRU would come back on the air, let's say, at 5 or 6 in the afternoon. And then in the evening, at night, they had to divide time some nights with a station in Evansville, Indiana, WGBF.
That just seems such a foreign notion to me.
It is a very foreign notion. Yeah. But a lot of that music was live, and it was native music. It was local music, and there was nothing canned about it. It was all very spontaneous, and I think probably fascinating if there were recordings of this stuff, and there aren't, unfortunately. But
I have a couple of questions before we run out of time. A lot of people ask, what does KFRU mean? And all of your you say WS, Watch Our State, or KT, whatever.
KLPW, Leslie P. Ware.
So what?
It really meant nothing when the licenses were handed out. And KFRU began on the 14th of January, 1925, in Bristow, Oklahoma. It was moved here in the summer of 25 when Stevens College bought it. It was just a progression of call signs as they were issued by the Department of Commerce. Now, they later came up with slogans tied with them. Kind friends, remember us was one of the things when Stevens owned it.
All right, so there is nothing that was meaningful of that when they were first assigned. The other thing is, you just mentioned January of 1925.
Correct.
KFRU call letters, KFRU, have just passed 87 years.
Yes.
What's the importance of that?
It's significant. It's the 6th oldest radio station in the state, continuously operating radio station in the state. It's older than KMOX, for instance, by about almost a year.
Yeah. Wow. What are some of the older stations in the state? Do you remember?
Well, there's a WIL, which is an FM station in St. Louis. The AM was sold off a number of years ago. WHB in Kansas City is a very, very old property that has been in Kansas City since 1922. KFUO is probably one of the oldest stations under continuous ownership. It's owned by the Lutheran Church. It's been on the air since 24. It's never been sold.
I worked in Joplin at a WMBH. So that was a W call letter. That would make
that was a portable radio station. There was a man named C.O. Carroll out of Chicago who had a half a dozen radio stations that moved around the country. And in 1927 and 28, when regulations were put in, the Federal Radio Commission said, stop, don't move anymore. So WMBH was in Joplin, and it was ordered not to move, not to leave. And so that's why it's there.
We have 2 minutes, and just over 2 minutes left. Give a story, back to Malin Aldridge for a moment, how he used to listen to police scanners and how he used to have the patrol or police in the station there.
Well, when television came in and started causing problems for KFRU, Malin decided that the route was news. And Malin had come out here. He had been news director of KXOK in St. Louis, and so he was a news nut. And he installed all these receivers. They weren't scanners. They were just receivers that were fixed to certain frequencies, and they were stacked in his office. He'd have the state patrol in there. He had the sheriff. He had the police. And so in the office, you had to listen to all this barking of these receivers going off. And if he heard a 1050, which was the state patrol's jargon for an accident, he was out the door in a New York second. He'd climb into this little station wagon, which was also full of radios and scanners and things like that. And he was, at the time, I think there were 6 or 7 state patrol officers assigned to Boone County. Well, he was like the 8th. And he was out there holding measuring tapes and helping survey the accident scene. And he'd get on the radio and he'd call back and he'd say, Malin Aldridge on the scene here. We have a 1050 at mile marker such and such, and here's the outlook and here's what's going on and traffic is backed up and blah, blah, blah.
And he would sleep with the scanner nearby his bed.
He had a pillow speaker in his bed to listen to this.
Wow.
But that's what local radio did. I mean, people would want to know, why is there a siren? And you'd turn on the radio and find out why there was a siren.
Yep.
Anything you want to? And I also liked one of the stories you told me about how he, how one of the things they used to do is follow cars around if they would be following a car and
the dollar prize.
Yeah, the dollar prize.
Yeah. He would. This was in the late 50s. It was a safety campaign, and he would follow these cars around. And if he went up to the car and found you were listening to KFRU, like there were a lot of choices to listen to, he'd hand you a dollar. But he had to be driving safely.
Yeah.
You couldn't be shifting lanes. You couldn't be DWI. You were driving safely, and it was all. He loved station wagons. He owned station wagons for years. He'd go to Del Cornell every December and buy a new station wagon. Wow. And then Smitty, who ran a radio shop here that sold Motorola stuff, he had put all these radios in, pull the old stuff out, and put it back in.
A real guy named Smitty?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, we're out of time this time, but I'll tell you, if people want to hear more of this and more of the history, think we haven't covered everything we need to, then let us know. You can email me at david.lyle@cumulus.com or give me a call and just say, let's hear more of that, or say, I'm historied out, but it's been fun, I think, this time. Chris, thanks for spending time with us. Chris Kellogg and Al Germond. John Duncan, the producer of the Heritage Show on News Talk 1400 KFRU.
You've been listening to the KFRU Heritage Series. News Talk 1400 KFRU, Columbia.